France, 1941. The country had been defeated. German troops occupied the north and west. In the south, the Vichy regime governed in the name of France while cooperating with Nazi Germany. Everywhere, newspapers still appeared on street corners. They carried headlines, they printed speeches, they offered sports results, weather reports, and carefully approved versions of reality. But the news had been captured. The official press told readers that collaboration was necessary, that Germany would win, that resistance was pointless, that obedience was patriotic. For millions of French people, the occupation did not just take away territory. It took away the ability to know what was true. And in that silence, a small group of resistors decided to create something dangerous. Not a bomb, not an army, a newspaper. They called it combat. The name was simple, direct. It did not promise safety, it promised a fight. At first, combat was not a powerful organization. It had no grand headquarters, no secure funding, no trained staff, and no legal protection. It had a few determined people, borrowed equipment, false identities, and an idea that could get every one of them arrested. Print the truth. In occupied France, that was enough to make you an enemy of the state. The newspaper was connected to a growing resistance movement led by men and women who believed that France had to remain alive beneath the surface of occupation. One of the central figures was Henri Freinet, a former army officer who refused to accept that defeat meant surrender. Freinet had seen what had happened to France. He understood that military resistance would take time. Weapons were scarce. Networks were fragile. The Germans were powerful. But people needed something before they could fight. They needed to believe they were not alone. That was what combat offered. A single sheet of paper could travel where a rifle could not. It could be slipped beneath a door, folded inside a coat, left on a train seat, passed from a factory worker to a teacher, from a priest to a farmer, from a student to a stranger who had earned trust. The paper could tell people that the war was not over. It could tell them that German victories were not inevitable. It could tell them that other French men and women were resisting. And perhaps most importantly, it could remind them that the official version of events was a lie. But every copy of combat had to be created under the eyes of the enemy. The German occupiers censored the press. The Vichy authorities hunted dissidents. The police opened letters, questioned neighbors, watched train stations, searched apartments, and followed leads that began with the smallest mistake. A suspicious landlord, a loose conversation in a cafe, a courier who carried too much paper, a printer who asked too many questions. One arrest could expose a whole network. And unlike a modern newsroom, there was no safe distance between the writer and the danger. The people who wrote the articles might also have been the people carrying bundles through the streets. The person arranging paper supplies might have been using a false name. The person receiving the finished pages might not know who had written them. That secrecy was not paranoia. It was survival. The first issues of Combat were primitive by the standards of ordinary journalism. They were produced with whatever equipment could be found. Small presses, duplicators, typewriters, hand-prepared stencils, ink, paper bought through unreliable channels or obtained under false pretenses. Nothing about it was easy. Paper itself was a problem. During wartime, paper was controlled, rationed, watched. Large purchases raised questions. Printers who suddenly worked at odd hours raised questions. Deliveries that did not match official orders raised questions. Even the sound of a machine could be dangerous. Imagine being in a basement late at night, the windows covered, the door locked, a printing press turning again and again in the dark. Every mechanical clatter seems too loud. Every car stopping outside might be police. Every knock on the door might be the end. The people who made combat learned to live with that fear. They had to. Fear did not disappear. It became part of the job. They wrote articles about the war, about the occupation, about the failures and betrayals of the Vichy regime. They argued that France could not be restored by waiting quietly for someone else to save it. They attacked the idea that collaboration was practical or honorable. And they did something the official newspapers could not do. They spoke as if France still belonged to the French. That was a radical act. The underground press did not need to convince everyone. It needed to reach enough people to break the feeling of isolation. Occupation thrives on isolation. If you believe you are the only person who hates what is happening, you stay quiet. You lower your voice, you avoid risks, you tell yourself that nothing can be done. But if someone hands you a forbidden newspaper, the world changes. Now you know there are others. Somewhere, someone has found a printer. Someone has written an article. Someone has risked arrest to bring this page to you. Someone believes resistance is possible. The newspaper was proof. Combat grew because it gave readers more than information. It gave them connection. And connection became organization. Readers became couriers. Couriers became recruiters. Small circles became cells. Resistance was built not only through spectacular acts of sabotage, but through countless quiet acts of trust. A woman might carry newspapers in a shopping bag. A railway worker might hide them among ordinary freight. A student might take a stack of copies across town on a bicycle. A shopkeeper might hand one to a customer who knew the right phrase. No one needed to know the entire network. In fact, most people did not. The less each person knew, the less they could reveal if caught. But secrecy had a cost. It meant living a divided life. A resistance worker could spend the day appearing ordinary, going to work, greeting neighbors, buying bread, smiling at officials. Then, at night, they might meet someone in a back room, accept a package, memorize an address, burn a list, or carry pages that could lead to a prison cell. Some of the people behind combat were already known to the authorities. Others were hunted only by shadow. The danger grew as the newspaper became more influential. The more copies printed, the more people needed to distribute them. The more people involved, the more chances there were for betrayal. And betrayal was always close. The German security apparatus and the Vichy police did not need to find everyone. They needed one weak point, one frightened courier, one informer, one intercepted message, one name found in a pocket. resistance networks were repeatedly broken by arrests. People were interrogated, imprisoned, tortured, deported, or executed. Some survived only because they had no names to give. Others were forced to make impossible choices under unbearable pressure. The story of combat is not a clean story of fearless heroes moving confidently toward victory. It is a story of people who were afraid and acted anyway. That is more difficult and more human. Among the movement's most important figures was Bertie Albrecht, a woman whose life had already taken her through social activism, political struggle, and personal risk long before the underground newspaper emerged. She became a key organizer in the resistance movement around combat. Albrecht understood that resistance required more than speeches. It required safe houses, money, contacts, documents, transport, and people willing to do work that would never receive public recognition. Her role was dangerous because organization leaves traces. A writer can destroy a draft. A courier can burn a note. But someone has to find the rooms. Someone has to coordinate the meetings. Someone has to make the network function. When the authorities closed in, the risks became brutally real. Bertie Albrecht was arrested. She was imprisoned. The resistance lost one of its most committed organizers. She did not live to see liberation. Her death was a reminder of what the underground press demanded from those who made it. Each issue of Combat was not merely written. It was paid for in anxiety, separation, prison, and sometimes death. Yet the newspaper continued. That is the remarkable part. The police could arrest individuals. They could seize equipment. They could close a printing site. They could infiltrate a local group. But they could not easily destroy an idea once it had been distributed across a country. Every time the authorities found one press, another had to be located. Every time a courier disappeared, someone else had to take the route. Every time a name became dangerous, a new identity had to be created. The newspaper survived because its creators adapted. It moved, it changed printers. It relied on networks that did not all know one another. It used trusted friends. Families, workers, students, and strangers brought together by the same refusal to accept the world as it was. Combat was never invincible. No underground organization was. But it became difficult to silence because it was no longer one office, one press, or one group of editors. It had become a living network. By 1943 and 1944, the resistance in France was changing. The Allied war effort was gaining momentum. German defeats had shattered the image of inevitable Nazi victory. The prospect of liberation no longer seemed like a distant fantasy. But the danger inside France intensified. The Gestapo and other security services hunted resistance groups with increasing urgency. Arrests continued. Deportations continued. Executions continued. And still the underground newspapers appeared. They appeared in cities and villages. They appeared in factories and universities. They appeared in railway stations, apartments, churches, and workplaces. They appeared because ordinary people were willing to risk everything for a few pages of uncensored words. In August 1944, Paris rose against German occupation. The liberation of the city was not a single, clean event. Fighting broke out. Barricades went up. Resistance fighters emerged into the open. Allied forces advanced toward the capital. For years, the men and women behind combat had written in secret. They had written knowing a raid could come before sunrise. They had written knowing the paper might be found before it reached a reader. They had written with false names, hidden presses, and uncertain futures. Now, as Paris was liberated, combat could finally be printed openly. The newspaper emerged from the underground and onto the streets. This was more than a practical change. It was symbolic. The paper that had survived censorship, arrests, and occupation was no longer a forbidden object passed hand to hand in darkness. It was public. It could be sold. It could be read in daylight. After liberation, the writer Albert Camus became closely associated with combat as its editor. Under his direction, the paper became one of the prominent voices in post-war France. But the most extraordinary chapter had already happened. The years when there was no guarantee of survival. The years when publishing an article could be an act of rebellion. The years when paper, ink, and a hidden machine could become weapons against an empire. The secret police could seize presses. They could imprison editors. They could terrorize distributors. They could make every act of communication dangerous. But they could not fully stop the newspaper because they could not fully stop the people who believed truth was worth the risk. That is the real power of an underground press. It does not defeat an occupation by itself. It does something more basic. It refuses to let the occupier own reality. It says that the official story is not the only story. It tells frightened people that they are not alone. And sometimes, in the darkest period of a country's history, that is where resistance begins.